Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We're here again to plunge into the sources you've shared and, well, tackle some really complex questions. And today, we are definitely wading into some deep waters. It's a monumental theological discussion, mostly drawn from the book of Revelation. Our focus today really is this ultimate question of spiritual identity. Who exactly is the bride of the Lamb?
Mm-hmm.
And look, this isn't just about, definitions. Our mission today is a serious deep dive into ideas about ultimate reward, maybe even spiritual hierarchy.
Mm-hmm.
We're facing this core conflict we found in the sources. Is this incredibly exalted title, the Bride of the Lamb, is it reserved just for one specific limited group, these 144,000 sealed individuals who show up right at the end?
Mm-hmm.
Or does the bride actually mean a much bigger, more inclusive group of faithful people? Stretching across all of history, maybe culminating with that final group.
Yeah, it's probably one of the highest stakes debates about identity in Scripture, wouldn't you say? Because it points directly to who gets the most honor, the most intimate position with Christ in, well, the new creation.
Yes.
And the sources you've given us, they lean heavily on Revelation, chapter 7, 14, 19, 21 especially. And they lay out two very clear and frankly, fiercely competing interpretive camps.
Right.
The text itself, it's so rich in symbolic language. You've got the New Jerusalem, the idea of first fruits, the wedding feast, all things that allow for this kind of deep disagreement in how we understand it.
Precisely. And our goal here, just to be clear, is to guide you through this material. We're not here to, settle the debate for you.
No.
But we want to clearly lay out the scriptural arguments, the theological thinking behind both views, the exclusive view that it's only the 144,000, and the inclusive view that it's this broader group of, let's say, spiritually accomplished individuals. We need to trace the logic for each side, see how they interpret the same symbols and end up in such different places.
Okay, so let's start maybe by setting the stage. We need to establish the main symbolic connection that, interestingly, both arguments actually agree on. And that's the identity of the city itself.
Okay, yeah, good place to start. Let's unpack that foundational idea. So the sources point us straight to Revelation 21, verses 9 and 10. This is where that symbolic link is made really explicit, isn't it?
It is.
An angel comes to John and says, "Come, I will show you the bride, the wife of the Lamb." And then what does he show him? Not a person, but the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God.
That connection, that linkage, it's foundational. It's non-negotiable for both sides, really. The bride is the New Jerusalem, and the New Jerusalem is the bride.
Right.
So that means the description we get of this heavenly city, all the architectural details, is not just, pretty language. It's actually a blueprint. It tells us about the identity, the makeup, the history of the people it represents. The real question becomes, how strictly do we read that blueprint?
And what a blueprint it is. The description is just, ultimate magnificence, isn't it?
Yeah.
It says the city has the glory of God, shines like a rare jewel, like jasper, crystal clear. It's this perfect image of, divine access, perfect order, purity.
Right. Absolutely. But as stunning as the city is visually, the really crucial details for figuring out who it represents, those are in the structure. Specifically, its defenses and its foundations. Revelation 21, verses 12 and 13, describe this great high wall with 12 gates.
12 gates?
Yeah, facing north, south, east, west. And critically, those gates have names written on them. The names of the 12 tribes of the children of Israel.
Okay, so the gate's the way in. The historical markers on the outside, they're anchored in the people of the Old Testament covenant, the 12 tribes of Israel. That sets up this lineage going way back.
Exactly. It emphasizes continuity. And then, right in the very next verse, Revelation 21.14, we get the other half of the picture. The city wall itself rests on 12 foundation stones.
And on those?
On those stones are the names of the 12 apostles of the Lamb. Ah, okay. So here's where it gets really interesting, and where that debate about exclusivity versus inclusivity has to grapple with the whole picture. You have the city, the spiritual entity, the bride, and it's resting on these two distinct but complementary, historically massive foundations.
Right.
The 12 tribes of Israel representing the Old Covenant, the original promises, and the 12 apostles of the Lamb representing the New Covenant, the whole Christian era that followed.
This dual nature, it's absolutely foundational to understanding this. If the city represents the bride, then the bride has to be made up of elements from both the Old Testament and the New Testament periods. It's like a single perfected building, but built on these two different, though related, historical pillars of faith.
So that duality seems to suggest inclusion right from the start, doesn't it? It implies God's people, whenever they lived, are part of this ultimate spiritual home.
It certainly seems to. Now, does the strict exclusive view acknowledge this duality? Or do they try to sort of sidestep the inclusion of those Old Testament saints represented by the gates?
Good question. They do acknowledge the duality, yes, but they argue that in the final reckoning, the time when the sealing happens, the 144,000 become the only true, sealed, perfected representation of those 12 tribes.
Oh, okay.
They see the 144,000 as the specific final fulfillment of the names on the gates. But hang on, before we jump too far ahead into that argument, we really need to properly introduce this unique group, the 144,000.
Right, good point. Let's bring in the other main player in this identity debate, the 144,000. This specific counted group we find in Revelation 7, and again later in chapter 14. Our sources define them very clearly. They're the number sealed marked by God, right, for protection and service. And they're drawn from every tribe of Israel, specifically 12,000 from 12 distinct tribes, adding up to exactly 144,000.
And this group isn't just defined by their number or their lineage. Revelation 14 gives them this set of really unique characteristics that seem to set them apart from, well, the rest of redeemed humanity.
What's that?
Well, for one, they can sing a new song that literally no one else in heaven can learn. That suggests a unique experience, a unique understanding, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
They're explicitly described as being redeemed from the earth.
And the sources also really highlight their intense purity. They're described as being undefiled with women. We should probably pause there for a second because that phrase is pretty loaded, especially for the exclusive argument.
Yeah.
How do our sources usually interpret that?
Yeah, that's a big one. A strictly literal reading that they are actual male virgins is sometimes proposed, but the symbolic reading is, frankly, much more common and probably more significant in this whole debate.
Okay.
In Revelation, which is so symbolic, women often represent religious systems or churches. Think of the great harlot, for example.
Right, yeah.
So being undefiled with women is usually taken to mean maintaining absolute spiritual purity. Resisting the temptations of, spiritual infidelity, avoiding being tainted by false teachings or unfaithfulness to Christ.
So it's a statement of ultimate spiritual faithfulness, keeping themselves pure through potentially the worst spiritual environment imaginable, the Great Tribulation. They're like the definition of an untainted remnant.
Exactly. And that level of purity is seen as qualifying them for their unique role. And then there's maybe their most famous trait. They follow the Lamb wherever he goes.
That implies such closeness, such obedience.
With utter dedication, unparalleled closeness. Yeah. And then we get to the term that really props up the exclusive argument, the thing that sets them apart from the general harvest. They are redeemed from humanity as first fruits to God and the Lamb.
Okay, first fruits. Why is that concept so powerful for claiming a unique, maybe even superior identity?
Well, first fruits come straight out of the Old Testament agricultural and sacrificial system, right? The first fruits weren't just the ones harvested chronologically first. They were special. They were consecrated. They were the initial sacred part offered to God, set apart before the main harvest came in. They sort of represented the dedication of the whole crop. So being called first fruits suggests the 144,000 occupy this unique spiritual category. Maybe a high point of spiritual perfection that distinguishes them from the wider group of redeemed people who come after or who represent the main harvest.
So it's not just about timing that they're the last group sealed, but it's a statement about their quality. They're the consecrated peak of the entire harvest.
That's how the exclusive view interprets it, yes, a qualitative designation. And the description finishes by saying they are without fault or deceit in their mouths, which points not just to how they act, but also to their doctrinal purity, their truthfulness.
Okay, so we have the New Jerusalem, the bride, this collective identity resting on those dual foundations, tribes, and apostles. And we have the 144,000, the specific number, highly purified, called first fruits, drawn from Israel's tribes right at the end. Now we need to really dig into how these two competing interpretations connect these pieces.
Right, let's dive into that first viewpoint.
Okay, let's make that transition. We're now looking in the argument for exclusivity. This view takes all those symbolic connections we just laid out, but applies a very strict, almost literal numerical interpretation to things like the sealing and the term first fruits. They essentially draw a hard line. The bride is only the 144,000, period.
Yeah, and it's a rigorous argument they build. It really focuses on the specific fulfillment of prophecy during the Great Tribulation. The idea is that the spiritual intensity, the unique empowerment needed for that specific time, it demands a higher reward and therefore a unique status.
All right, let's trace how they build this wall of exclusivity around the 144,000. starting with the city itself, the New Jerusalem structure. How do they use that?
Okay, the core of it, like you said, is almost like a mathematical deduction, pulling together Revelation 21 and Revelation 7. The chain of logic really depends on a kind of substitution principle, that the 144,000 are the only true final representatives of the 12 tribes when all is said and done.
Okay, walk us through that logic chain one more time, step by step.
Okay, step 1. We agreed. The bride is the New Jerusalem. That's Rev 21.9 to 10. Step 2. The New Jerusalem's gates, its structure, rests on the 12 tribes of Israel, according to Rev 21.1. This represents the covenant people.
Got it.
Step 3. The sealed, marked remnant of those 12 tribes, the ones specifically chosen by God to navigate and survive that final, intense age, they are explicitly numbered at 144,000 in Rev 7.4. And it's very specific, 12,000 sealed individuals from 12 specific tribes.
Right, so the deduction becomes, if the bride's identity is founded on the 12 tribes, and only the 144,000 are the specifically sealed, true representation of those tribes at the climax of history,
Right.
then the 144,000 must be the exclusive singular bride.
That's exactly the argument. It suggests that the historical 12 tribes were, in a way, too broad, maybe imperfect. The true, purified spiritual body gets condensed into this final perfect number. The wider church, the millions of believers across 2,000 years, they don't have that same specific, sealed tribal representation. They're part of the bigger harvest, sure, but they're not the fulfillment of that foundational structure in the same way.
Okay, but doesn't that immediately create friction with the other foundation, the 12 apostles? If the city rests just as much on the apostles, and the 144,000 represent the tribes, where does that leave the apostles themselves? Are Peter, James, John, are they not in the city they helped found? Are they just guests, even though their names are literally carved into the foundation stones? That seems odd.
That is precisely the point where the inclusive view pushes back hard. The exclusive view has to find a way around that. They tend to argue that the apostles' names on the foundations represent the doctrine, the teaching, the bedrock upon which the city is built.
The principle.
While the 144,000 are the actual inhabitants, the residents who uniquely fulfill the covenant identity represented by the gates. It's like separating the building materials, the apostolic doctrine, from the final perfected tenets, the 144,000. But yes, it's definitely a complex distinction to maintain. They'd say the 144,000 are the ultimate fulfillment of both Old and New covenants, all embodied in one perfected group at the end.
Okay, let's move to the second pillar, the first fruits argument from Revelation 14. We touched on the agricultural background. How does being first fruits translate into eternal status in this view?
Well, as first fruits, they are inherently set apart, given priority. In the temple system, that first fruits offering was sacred. It wasn't just like the rest of the harvest.
It was special.
Exactly. So if the 144,000 are the first fruits redeemed from humanity, this title implies they occupy a kind of spiritual category that's permanently distinct, maybe even superior, to the general body of believers who are seen more as the rest of the harvest that follows.
And that distinction, that unique label, must logically correspond to a unique superior reward, right? Otherwise, what's the point of the label?
Precisely. If everyone ends up with the same ultimate status, then calling the 144,000 first fruits kind of loses its theological punch, its sacrificial meaning. Their unique status, earned through their exceptional purity and endurance during the end times, it demands the highest reward possible, which, in this view, is being the bride. It ties into that idea of reward being proportional to the trial and the achievement.
Which brings us neatly to the wedding imagery itself.
Yeah.
And the standard required to be the bride. Revelation 19 talks about the marriage supper, and the bride is given this special privilege. She gets to be clothed in fine linen, bright and pure. And the text explicitly tells us what that linen represents.
The righteous deeds of the saints, yes. Yeah. And this verse is absolutely critical for the exclusive argument. They really zero in on the fact that the garment isn't just given for faith alone, it's specifically for righteous deeds. And they argue that the level of spiritual faithfulness, the depth of sacrifice required to maintain that absolute purity during the Great Tribulation, facing the ultimate pressure from the beast, is just so incredibly high that only the 144,000 will actually meet the standard. They're the only ones who will fulfill the criteria for those specific righteous deeds.
So the idea is that their deeds are qualitatively superior, almost on a different level.
Yeah.
Because the spiritual battle they fought and won was uniquely intense, uniquely horrific.
Yes, that's the core of it. They endured a tribulation unlike any before, facing death constantly while remaining, as Revelation says, without fault. Therefore, their actions, their endurance, their purity, Those are the only deeds that truly qualify for that fine linen. In this interpretation, they are the only ones who get to wear the wedding dress, so to speak.
Wow. Okay, but if they're the only ones wearing the garment,
Yeah.
what about, the countless martyrs throughout history, people who died under Roman emperors, during the Reformation, and persecutions across 2,000 years? They certainly clothed themselves in righteous deeds, often paying the ultimate price. The exclusive view seems to say that all these faithful sacrificing witnesses, they're just guests at the wedding, not the bride herself. That feels, well, it seems to create a pretty stark hierarchy that might contradict how we usually think of Christ's relationship with all his suffering people.
It absolutely creates a stark spiritual hierarchy, yes.
Yeah.
And sometimes a difficult one to accept. To justify it, proponents of this view argue that while earlier saints were indeed faithful, maybe incredibly so, their deeds and spiritual achievements didn't quite reach that absolute pinnacle of purity and, crucially, strategic necessity required of that final sealed group. They'll be blessed, certainly, highly honored, perhaps.
But not the bride.
But not granted that ultimate intimate status of being the bride. The difference between being the bride and being a guest at the wedding is profound. It's the difference between ultimate intimacy and, say, privileged association.
Okay. So to kind of bolster the reason for this preferential treatment, this superior status, the exclusive view sometimes uses an analogy, right? Something about timing and reward.
Yes, they often bring up the wedding at Cana from the Gospel of John. Remember, Jesus turns water into wine, and the master of the feast is stunned because the hosts save the best wine for last.
Ah, right. Usually you serve the good stuff first.
Exactly. So the interpretation here is that this points to a divine principle. God saves the best for the end. The saints of the final period, the 144,000, they receive the best spiritual endowment, the best empowerment, and therefore they get the best reward because they're reserved for the grand finale. They are the late wine, the best wine.
And this preference, this best wine, isn't arbitrary. It's directly linked to their strategic role. They're specially equipped because they have a unique job to do in that final confrontation.
Precisely. And this is where a more technical, prophetic concept comes into play, something called the early rain and the late rain. It's crucial to their argument. The 144,000 are described in these sources as being the strategic final battle weapon.
Okay.
They are the chosen agents, specifically empowered to endure the absolutely horrific conditions of the Great Tribulation and overcome the enemy.
We should probably unpack that rain concept a bit. What's the difference prophetically between the early rain and the late rain, and why does one supposedly grant superior power?
Okay, so this idea has roots in Old Testament prophecy, like in the book of Joel, and it's seen as having a New Testament fulfillment, starting maybe with Acts chapter 2, Pentecost. The early rain, spiritually speaking, refers to that initial, powerful outpouring of the Holy Spirit at Pentecost.
Right, the birth of the church.
Yes, the power that launched the early church, sustained the apostles, fueled the early martyrs. That early empowerment was enough to establish the church, spread the gospel, and get things going. The sources you provided suggest the late rain is a prophesied, final, overwhelming, intensified outpouring of the Holy Spirit happening just before Christ returns.
And why the need for intensification? Why more power later?
Because the spiritual opposition in the Great Tribulation, embodied by the beast, will possess unprecedented demonic power. The exclusive argument insists that only the 144,000, because they receive the Holy Spirit to the full measure of this late rain, will have the necessary divine power. The Greek word is dunamis, that authority and might to overcome the beast's influence, withstand the pressure, and maybe even help finish the final harvest.
I see.
So this superior empowerment, this unique function tied to the late rain, is used to justify their superior spiritual stature as the exclusive bride. The power matches the status.
Okay, that is a really compelling case they make.
Yeah.
It's internally consistent, very tightly defined, rooted in specific numbers, the first fruits title, the idea of unique end-time power, and that proportionate standard of righteous deeds.
It's a strong argument for exclusivity.
It is.
Now, though, we need to make a sharp turn and look at the counter-argument. The view that challenges this strict boundary and insists the bride is actually a much larger collective identity spanning the ages.
Right, the inclusive view. Now, they acknowledge all the same symbols we've discussed, the city, the gates, the foundations, the 144,000, but they fundamentally disagree on that principle of reduction, of narrowing it all down to just that one final group.
Okay.
This perspective argues that the New Jerusalem symbol represents the entire body of those who reached a certain high standard of spiritual achievement, particularly through sacrifice, across all of history. They believe that focusing too strictly on the number 144,000 ignores the bigger picture, the continuity of God's redemptive work through the ages. So their counter-argument tries to shift the focus away from just a number and a specific time slot, the last sealed group, and towards a shared quality, a standard of faith and sacrifice that applies to all martyrs whenever they live.
Exactly. And they start by tackling the gates and the tribes directly. They accept, yes, the New Jerusalem is the bride, and yes, it's symbolized by the 12 tribes on the gates. However, they argue that in the New Covenant era, we have to look past the literal, physical, or numerical Israel to understand the spiritual substance that those tribes now represent.
So the names on the gates are more like spiritual symbols, not strict ethnic or numerical limits.
Precisely. They point to supporting texts, like Acts chapter 7, verse 38. Stephen is speaking there, and he refers to the church in the wilderness, the ecclesia in the wilderness when talking about Moses and the Israelites. This establishes the idea, they argue, that the true spiritual substance of the 12 tribes in God's larger plan is actually the church. Therefore, the city's gates aren't exclusively for a tiny remnant of physical descendants at the end, but they represent the entire community of faith centered on Christ, stretching all the way back, perhaps even to Abraham, and forward to the end.
Okay, but here's a really important distinction we need to make, based on the sources for this view. If the church is the spiritual substance of the tribes, does that mean every single person who ever called themselves a Christian, regardless of their commitment or life, is part of the bride?
No, absolutely not. That's a key point. The sources supporting this inclusive view are very clear on this. While the church provides the general pool, the spiritual substance, not all members of the church automatically qualify as the bride. They actually maintain their own kind of exclusivity, but it's based on spiritual worthiness and sacrifice, not just timing.
Okay, so who qualifies then?
In this inclusive view, the bride is reserved only for the martyr witnesses. Those who demonstrated ultimate faithfulness, often proven through martyrdom, or those who achieved the very highest standard of spiritual purity and dedication, even if they weren't literally killed, they are the purified core within the larger church.
I see. So the inclusive view is still highly selective compared to the whole body of believers worldwide. But crucially, it's inclusive of all who meet that high standard the martyr witnesses, regardless of which century they lived in.
Exactly. That ensures that a martyr who died, say, under Nero in 64 AD, receives the same ultimate status, the same relationship with Christ as one of the 144,000 sealed during the final tribulation.
Okay, that makes sense. It maintains a high standard, but applies it consistently across time.
And this point gets reinforced when they define the New Jerusalem not just as a city, but as the ultimate sacred space. The sources define it as the ultimate Holy of Holies.
Okay. In the Old Testament temple, the Holy of Holies was the absolute center, God's dwelling place, right? Super restricted access, only the high priest, only once a year. So the eternal city being the Holy of Holies implies the highest possible level of access, the closest possible intimacy with God.
Right. So if the city is the Holy of Holies, then the condition for being the bride isn't just about being around at the end or surviving the tribulation. It's about being spiritually worthy of that ultimate access, that ultimate closeness. The source states the condition this way. Only those who are worthy to enter the New Jerusalem, those who lived a life demonstrating they were worthy of seeing God in the Holy of Holies, they are the bride.
So that shifts the requirement away from a specific number, 144,000, and towards a universal, timeless standard of spiritual achievement. The achievement of being able to stand directly in God's presence without being consumed, metaphorically speaking.
Precisely. And that kind of worthiness, they argue, applies to anyone who attains that level of spiritual purity and closeness to God, whether they died in the first century or they're part of the final group. If you are worthy of dwelling in the Holy of Holies, you are the bride. The key is the quality of the spiritual life and sacrifice, not the timing of when it happened.
This perspective seems to gain a lot of traction when we look outside the symbolic intensity of Revelation and consider the broader sweep of faith and sacrifice in the New Testament, particularly Hebrews chapter 11, the Hall of Faith.
Yes, Hebrews 11 is huge for the inclusive argument. It recounts the stories of Old Testament saints, people like Abel, Noah, Abraham, Moses, Rahab. All these figures who lived by faith endured incredible hardship and often died without receiving the things promised. The text pictures them as strangers and pilgrims on earth, seeking something better, a better homeland.
And the city, the New Jerusalem, is directly tied to their reward, isn't it?
Hmm.
Hebrews 11, verses 13 to 16, it explicitly says that because these faithful people, these martyrs of faith, in a sense were seeking a heavenly country, God wasn't ashamed to be called their God because he has prepared a city for them.
Think about the weight of that. He has prepared a city for them. If the New Jerusalem is the city God prepared specifically for these ancient faithful witnesses, these pre-New Covenant figures, and we know the New Jerusalem is the bride, well, doesn't that strongly imply that these ancient faithful must also share in the title and status of the bride?
Yeah, that creates a real theological challenge for the strict exclusive view, doesn't it? If the city, which equals bride, was prepared for all these people who died in faith seeking that better resurrection, but the exclusive view says only the 144,000 are the bride, then what exactly is the status of Abel or Abraham or Moses inside that city? Are they just living in the suburbs? Are they historical footnotes on the gates? It seems inconsistent.
The inclusive view argues it's illogical. Why would God prepare the highest reward, the city itself, for these historical figures, only to then strip them of the city's most exalted title, the bride? They sought the city, God prepared it for them. That seems to prove the status is tied to faithfulness and sacrifice throughout history, not just appearing at the very end.
Which leads us to what might be the most powerful doctrinal argument against limiting the bride strictly to the 144,000. The explicit statements made by the Apostle Paul himself, who was writing nearly 2,000 years before that final group would even exist.
Right. Paul wasn't talking about some abstract future group. His job was to define the relationship between Christ and the church in his own time. And in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 2, Paul makes this incredibly direct statement about the believers in Corinth. And remember, the Corinthian church was far from perfect. It was a messy early congregation.
Yeah, it definitely had its problems. What did he say to them?
He said his goal, his desire, was to present them, the Corinthian believers, to Christ as a pure virgin, betrothed to one husband. And our sources really emphasize the specific Greek word Paul uses there for betrothed, harmasa. It means to join, to fit together, to unite someone to another in preparation for marriage. He was acting as the spiritual father arranging the betrothal.
Okay, wow. So that creates a serious dilemma for the exclusive view, doesn't it?
Well,
Paul, an apostle inspired by God, teaching foundational truth about the church's relationship with Christ.
no.
He was telling believers almost 2 millennia ago that they were already betrothed to Christ, intended to be presented as a pure virgin. That sounds exactly like the definition of the bride to be.
It does. So the problem is, if the status of bride could only ever apply retroactively to the 144,000 at the very end of time, then what was Paul doing? Was his entire ministry of defining the church's relationship to Christ as a pure betrothed virgin just conditional? Was it misleading? Or worse, was it simply false?
And that seems impossible, right? If we believe the apostles taught divine truth. So does Paul's action effectively prove that the status of being betrothed to Christ, the core identity of the bride, was meant for the faithful in all generations who met the standard?
That's exactly what the inclusive view asserts. Paul's explicit statements and actions demonstrate that the status of bride is fundamentally doctrinal. It defines the intimate covenant relationship between Christ and his purified, sacrificial people across all time. It's not merely a chronological designation for the last one standing.
Therefore, the conclusion for the inclusive side is pretty clear. All martyr witnesses, all those who achieve that high standard of purity and faithfulness, they're part of the body of Christ. And the spiritual status of the bride must encompass this entire collective body spanning history. Otherwise, the promises made through apostles like Paul seem to lose their consistency and reliability.
So we've laid out two really powerful yet competing interpretations based on the same texts. Now, maybe in this final section, we should try to move towards a synthesis. Can we find a way to reconcile the undeniable strategic importance of the 144,000 without necessarily excluding the historical martyrs from the bride status?
Yeah, that feels like the right direction. We need to integrate the unique role of the 144,000 that the exclusive view highlights, but maybe within the broader framework that the inclusive view provides. And it seems like timing is key here. The exclusive view really hung its hat on the unique timing of the 144,000. Let's explore how that timing might connect to the whole body of the bride.
Okay. The source material points us towards a really profound passage, Revelation chapter 6, verses 9 to 11. This is where John sees the souls of those who have been martyred for their faith. They're under the altar in heaven, and they're crying out, asking God, "How long, O Lord, holy and true, until you judge and avenge our blood?" They want justice. They want the end to come.
Right. They're impatient for the consummation.
Exactly. And what's God's answer? It's essentially, wait. They're told to rest a little while longer until the full number of their fellow servants and brethren, who were also destined to be killed just as they had been, was completed.
Ah, okay. So that implies there's a specific divinely set quota, a required number of martyrs that has to be met before the final events, like the judgment and the wedding, can actually happen.
That's the implication, yes. The final climax is held back until this appointed number is full. The wedding feast, the judgment they can't start until the full roster of required martyr witnesses is finalized.
And the timing for when this number gets completed is crucial, isn't it? The sources seem to indicate that this appointed number is filled right around the time the 144,000 make their appearance, which is specified as being near the beginning of that final period of intense tribulation, often called the last 1 week.
Yes, and this is what gives the 144,000 their immense critical significance, but perhaps in a different way than the exclusive view suggests. Maybe they aren't the only bride, but they are the group whose appearance and faithfulness are necessary for the completion of the bride.
I see.
They represent that final, indispensable wave of faithful witnesses whose sacrifice, whose endurance, fulfills the required quota. Their unique function isn't to be the bride exclusively, but to finish the body of witnesses so the marriage can finally take place.
Okay, so their appearance signals that the bride, which is the whole collective body of martyr witnesses throughout history, is now fully formed, fully constituted, sealed, and ready. They fulfill that ancient requirement we heard about from the souls under the altar. Their role is about quantitative completion, not necessarily qualitative replacement of everyone who came before.
That framework allows us to value both the historical martyrs and the final 144,000, which leads us right to the point that might reconcile the two views, making a clear distinction between spiritual status and strategic power or function.
Right. The exclusive view really emphasized the unique power of the 144,000 stemming from that late rain endowment.
Yes, and we have to acknowledge that the text suggests the 144,000 will perform mighty deeds, great power, because of that full end-time measure of the Holy Spirit, the late rain. That certainly distinguishes their function, their capacity for miracles, their ability to withstand the beast, perhaps, from earlier saints who operated more under the influence of the early rain. They are equipped for a unique, intense, strategic purpose right at the climax. But the inclusive perspective brings in that vital caveat, which we find hinted at even back in Acts 1.8 and reinforced in the sources. The glory for any spiritual power demonstrated belongs only to the Holy Spirit and to God, not to the human vessel exercising it.
Ah, that's a crucial theological point.
It is. The power doesn't originate from the 144,000 themselves as if they are inherently superior beings. It's an empowerment given to them necessary for a specific strategic job they have to do in the final moments of history.
So, the sources are basically saying, look, the person who receives the late rain power isn't automatically a better Christian or higher status than someone who lived faithfully under the early rain. The Spirit is the one who is great, not the person temporarily filled with the Spirit's power. Whether they lived early or late, they only achieved faithfulness, perhaps even martyrdom, because the Spirit enabled them.
Exactly. So the synthesis becomes much clearer. The 144,000 have a special function. They receive unique, intense power, making them that strategic weapon which is necessary to complete the body of the bride and withstand the final onslaught. However, this vital strategic importance, this unique empowerment, doesn't negate the shared eternal status that they hold alongside all those throughout history who also loved Jesus supremely and were martyred or lived lives of equivalent sacrifice. All who achieve that worthiness to enter the Holy of Holies share the status of the bride.
Okay, so it boils down to the difference between being uniquely equipped for the final battle, that's the 144,000, and having the same fundamental relationship with the Lamb, which is the bride, the collective of all purified witnesses across time. The 144,000 are maybe the crowning jewels of the bride, the final perfectly prepared members who complete the body, but they are still members of that larger historical body.
That seems to be a way to harmonize the different emphases. And finally, we can anchor this synthesis by looking at the description of the ultimate reward promised. The millennial kingdom, the 1,000-year reign described in Revelation chapter 20, verse 6. The promise given there seems to encompass that whole body of those who achieve this ultimate spiritual faithfulness.
Right. It says that all those who participate in the first resurrection, which includes the martyrs, are blessed and holy, and they're promised this incredibly high level of service and intimacy. They will serve as priests of God and of Christ, and they will reign with him for 1,000 years.
And that reward being priests, reigning with Christ, it's defined by intimacy, authority, the highest possible honor and function. And crucially, This reward seems to apply equally to the historical martyrs, like those souls under the altar. Maybe even the Old Testament witnesses who Hebrews 11 says were seeking that better resurrection, and the final 144,000. The reward description doesn't seem to differentiate between them in terms of this core status.
So the logic of the inclusive view finds its final support here. If the New Jerusalem, the bride's home, was prepared for all those who died seeking the better homeland, Hebrews 11, and all who take part in the first resurrection share the highest possible reward of reigning as priests with Christ, Revelation 20, it strongly suggests that the fundamental status of the bride is shared collectively by all of them.
So we can probably conclude, by synthesizing these sources, that the New Jerusalem is ultimately prepared for all martyr witnesses, not exclusively the 144,000. All these faithful witnesses together constitute the collective bride, the spiritual substance of that holy city. And that city, that bride, is brought to its glorious completion by the unique, empowered, strategically vital appearance of the 144,000 at the very end.
Wow. Okay, this has been an incredibly detailed, deep dive into some really complex and sometimes, highly charged scriptural interpretation. We've seen the exclusive argument, very powerful, very numerically driven, using that tight symbolic logic, connecting the 144,000's specific status as first fruits and their unique end-time deeds directly to the New Jerusalem structure.
And we've balanced that really strongly, I think, against the inclusive argument, which rests more on the consistency of God's plan across all of history, using those doctrinal anchors from Paul's letters in the book of Hebrews to argue that the status of betrothed virgin and the promise of the city was always intended for all martyr witnesses, from the very beginning right up until that final sealing.
The sources seem to hint that the way to reconcile this might lie in that concept of something better. Remember Hebrews 11.4, it says God had reserved something better for the New Testament saints, specifically so that the Old Testament saints wouldn't be made perfect apart from them. So the idea of gradation, of different levels or timings of blessing, it's actually biblical.
Right. The question then becomes, what is that better thing, or maybe even best thing, that the 144,000 receive? Yes, they likely receive the best thing, in some sense, being the final climactic group. But we have to carefully identify what that best thing actually is. Is it a distinction in your ultimate eternal status? Is it the sole right to be called the bride? Which, as we saw, seems to create tension with Paul's promises and the promises to the ancient faithful in Hebrews.
Or, and this is really the final provocative thought we want to leave you with based on our dive into these sources, is the better thing, the best wine, reserved for the 144,000, actually the intense divine empowerment and the unique strategic importance they receive in that final hour?
Is it the superior power of the late rain, that best wine saved for the very last moment, which enables them to fulfill a specific, final, absolutely indispensable strategic role? A role that completes and glorifies the larger collective bride composed of martyrs from all ages.
So the ultimate question for you to ponder is this. Is the difference between the 144,000 and all the other faithful martyr witnesses throughout history primarily a difference in eternal identity and relationship, their fundamental status? Or is it primarily a difference in their strategic function and unique empowerment, their specific power and role in the final act?
That distinction, however you lean, it has profound implications for how we understand reward, the value of sacrifice across time, and the nature of the church's ultimate intimacy with Christ.